Kia ora and welcome to The Prosperity Project, a podcast where we are on a mission to empower you financially. I'm your host, Nadine Higgins. And if you are wondering who the heck I am to tell you anything about finances, well, I started out as a business journalist, and these days I'm a finance columnist, an investor, and a financial advisor and coach. But I am also still figuring it out. I do not claim to be the font of all knowledge, which is why I will be bringing in the experts and mining their big brains every week for all the things you and I need to know. The word retirement can prompt a range of reactions. Some people yawn because it's ages away and there's heaps of time to sort it out. Some people feel a little uncomfortable because it's not ages away and they're not sure if they're sorted. And some panic because it's just around the corner and they know they're not sorted. I got this email from a listener, Sandra, who I think is in one of the latter two stages. She wrote, I'm 57, I've been single for 20 years, and most of that time I've been self-employed. I've struggled watching my friends over the years with two incomes, traveling, upgrading their homes, new cars, etc. I work long hours and don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. I realise that I actually lack focus. My relationship with money hasn't been great, and as I get closer to retirement age, I'm starting to realize it's now or never to start turning that around. But I am so confused as to how to do that. So thank you for that, Sandra. And just a reminder that you can send any questions you have to nadine.higgins@nzherald.co.nz. Look, retirement is a big topic, but I wanted to at least get the conversation started. And to help us do that, I'm joined by Tom Hartman, the personal finance lead at the Retirement Commission. Kia ora, Tom.
Kia ora. Great to be with you, Nadine. Thanks.
It is a big topic, but it's also a big worry for someone like Sandra. She says she feels like she's not getting anywhere. I'm wondering how you prepare for retirement when you are just focused on the here and now and getting by week to week, day to day.
Yeah, it's a great question. It also takes into account that KiwiSaver, as an employment savings scheme, was really more made for employees as opposed to those who are self-employed. Obviously, there is the government contribution that a maximum of $521 every year, and over a career, maybe that can add up to, I think we estimated once, about $35,000. So that can make a difference. But there's really not those employer contributions and those regular employee contributions that are building funds for the long term.
Is that a big missing piece? Because lots of Kiwis are self-employed and therefore they don't have this mystical employer to chip in the 3% or sometimes more. It's all on them.
Well, this is undoubtedly one of the areas that we would like to see better coverage from KiwiSaver for that self-employed population. But it all comes down to how many dollars are flowing into, are being set aside for the future and are being invested. So keep in mind, because there aren't really specialized tax concessions, there's no caps to how much you can put in to KiwiSaver. It's really about how much can you set aside from the present day and from income, and how much can you invest for the long term. Take advantage of compounding returns over that and generate as much of a lump sum as possible for those days when you step back from paid work.
So someone else like Sandra who is self-employed, what would you suggest that they do to try and plug the gap of what the employer is not contributing? Do they double their own contributions? Do they just put in enough to get the government tax credit? Do they save outside of KiwiSaver? Do they do something else?
Well, definitely people's situations, vary widely. So again, this is not personalized financial advice. I mean, I would advise them to meet with someone like you and put together a plan. But it is about the dollars going into a system that grows your money. If there's nothing going into that system, and I'm speaking about KiwiSaver here, then there's not a lot that's going to come out. So even if for someone who's working part-time, they might not be self-employed, but they don't have a lot of income, they're not going to get a lot of results out of the system.
So, how might you like to see the system change so that those who are self-employed get as much of a hand as those who are?
It really comes down to whatever we can do in order to help people to contribute more and get more out of that system. And there might be, different solutions that policymakers can come up with, employers can come up with. But anything that we could do that would increase those contributions and get people to a better position over the long term for that time when they're ready to step back from paid work.
What about the other facet of Sandra's situation? She's single, and she's obviously drawn that disparity that when there's a two-income household, they're upgrading the car and they're going on holidays because there's two incomes flowing in. How much harder is it for someone to not only save for retirement, but exist in retirement when they're on their own?
Well, it really comes down to income. See, all of financial capability really comes down to not how much you can make, but how much you can keep. Right. And so a double income household, obviously, it would typically have more income, but would also be able to share some of the expenses. So, for example, my wife and I, we share a single car. If I was on my own and had to cover that car all on my own, obviously, it would be very different outgoings. So there are two sides of that coin that make it more difficult for someone who's on their own and depending on a single income coming in.
I guess one of her key concerns is at age 57, she's wondering, have I left it too late? And I get asked that question a lot, usually with a panicked look in people's eyes. Obviously, we know that if you start earlier, it's much easier, but is it too late in your late 50s?
Yeah, we get this question on Sorted as well, and what we repeat is it's really never too late because everything that you can do to prepare will make a difference to that moment when you step back and retire. There's that old adage, whether the best time to start was 20 years ago or even 10, 15 years ago, and the second best time to start is today. And really, so it's a seize the moment sort of thing. And it's also relative to where you are right now. So anything you can do will make the situation better.
We keep talking about the age of 65 like it's some arbitrary line in the sand, but that's only the age of entitlement. And I guess if you're not feeling ready financially or for any other reason to retire at 65, you're not forced to, right? And if you're not going to have enough, your options, I guess, are to earn more, spend less, which is not always that easy, but you could work longer. How many people are actually doing that and relying on that?
Yeah, well, I was surprised just today to find this out. Actually, it was a big eye opener for me. If you go back to the year 2000, those aged 60 to 69, only about 15% of that age group were still working. But today it's close to half. So it's jumped up. So retirement is changing. People are working longer. Another way to think about it is all the people over 65, if you think about them, a quarter of them are still working. A quarter of everyone above 65. So obviously, this is one of the ways we can adapt, and it can make a meaningful difference to how much you retire on by adjusting your retirement age. You mentioned the age of entitlement. That just means you can get NZ Super and you can withdraw your KiwiSaver, so there's no more restrictions on it. But again, there's nothing prohibiting you from working a couple years longer or something like that, still receiving NZ Super, and you can make a really big difference to how much you'll have in retirement.
Yeah, because if you're taking less out of how much you've got saved, it'll last longer, right? You're just delaying the point at which you start eating into that nest egg.
That's
but I
right.
guess there are risks, right? There's redundancy and ill health and all of the things that can intervene. But if you're if you're 25 and you're like, don't worry, I'm going to work till I'm 80, that might not be possible.
Yeah, I mean, life happens and life changes, and so our reality. But I think what we're finding is that people might not necessarily continue their chosen career, but they might alter the way they're working. They might work more casually, less hours, different, something that's a little bit less taxing or more enjoyable, or something like that. They might find different. So people are adaptable, and there are very many different levers and ways of getting this done and figuring out your retirement.
We'll talk about some of the steps you can take shortly. But first, I want to talk about the question that's probably the number one retirement question I get asked is, how much do I need? And we read the headlines that it's $1 million, maybe it's $2 million, it's $500,000. Pick a number and they all sound scary. But there's just been an update to the Massey University expenditure guidelines of what people are actually spending in retirement. What intel does that give us?
Yeah, it is unfortunate sometimes when the headlines come out and say, for example, someone from the financial services industry will come out and say, hey, you need $1 million or you need $2 million. It's sort of, all it does is have people throw up their hands and say, well, I'll never get there, so I'll just live for today. It's not worth it.
I'll just buy the jet ski and go on the holiday, and retirement can take care of itself.
Which would be a shame, because again, anything you can do, to prepare will be helpful. And then this question, how much is enough? Again, there's a large variation on how people live, almost as much variation as we know that there is in incomes today, what people are making from the lower end of the spectrum to the very high end of the spectrum. So how much is enough? You can answer that question in different ways. But what's valuable about the Massey numbers that you mentioned is that it's based on surveys of what retirees are spending today. So it's a good way of saying, well, this is what retirees are spending today, and so therefore it gives us a good idea on how much we might need. Is
the flaw in those numbers, though, that's how they're actually spending, but not necessarily how they'd like to be spending, just what they can afford to spend?
Well, there are two sort of tiers of spending that those numbers tell us. And one is for people, what they call more of a no frills lifestyle. And those numbers probably do, express what people need to spend. Obviously, they could probably spend more if they had it, but they're getting by on that. But there's also a choices lifestyle that is expressed in those numbers. And so those are people who are getting by with a few luxuries. And I invite people to, unpack the report more to understand what that means. So, but for those people, we can assume that they are spending more along the lines of what they want to spend, as opposed to just getting by on what they need to spend.
So, I did do a little bit of digging into those numbers. And the one thing I would want to call out to people is when it talks about a no-frills existence, it really does mean that. I think the no-frills for a single person in a provincial area, they spend $12 a week on fruit and vegetables and $15 a week on meat, and I think $8 on clothing and footwear. It is not a luxury existence. Yeah. And yet that number is still more than super. So that tells us that we all need to have some level of savings, right? Just to get by.
Yeah. So in essence, the most important thing we can know to get started is how much is NZ Super? And that varies every year. But at the moment, for one person, for example, tax at the M rate, it's $522 a week. Okay. So 522. And if we can remember that number, then we can start to understand, well, okay, that's what it provides. It's going to change over time because it's adjusted each year. But it's easy to understand that actually there'll be a gap. But, 522 for most people will not cover all of their expenses. For two people, it's $803 per week. So that's the place where to start. And so then the question becomes, retirement planning all comes down to, what is the gap? How much of a gap do you think you have between what NZ Super provides and what you'll need for your lifestyle? And that is, in essence, what retirement planning is here in New Zealand, is planning to fill that gap and understanding how to fill that gap.
Well, and also understanding what is the life you actually want to lead cost, which is maybe a bit of an open question.
Yeah, yeah. People have different aspirations for their lifestyles, but they also are, in a sense, used to living in a certain way too, and having certain costs. But another way to look at it is usually people in retirement internationally they use a 70% rule. So for example, in your income, if you're used to living off of say $100,000 a year, in retirement maybe 70% of that, $70,000 a year, is what you need. So that's another way of doing it, because you typically spend less on work-related items. You typically might travel less regularly, have less of a commute, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might need about 70% of what your income is. And so that's another way of if you're preparing to try to understand, well, how do I replace that 70%? How do I get that? And NZ Super is a part of that equation. And then that gap on top of it will be.
So then if the gap that we're told about isn't necessarily, as a broad brush, $1 million or $2 million or whatever the number is of the day, what do the expenditure guidelines tell us? Let's say that you retire at 65, you maybe live to 90, so 25 years. If you want to have a comfortable retirement, what does that number look like?
Yeah, so let's those numbers sort of tell us different things on whether you live in the main centers, such as Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch, or everywhere else in New Zealand, more in the region. So we can slice it up there a little bit. But let's just talk about a single person, just to keep it simple to start with, if that's okay. So if you're living a no frills lifestyle in one of those main centers, it's saying retirees now are spending $688 a week. So how much would you need as a lump sum to retire with in order to have that amount? You'd need $181,000 saved.
And there must be, as there always is with numbers, some assumptions in that, right? That you are not just putting that money under the mattress, you are investing it so that it keeps its purchasing power, has some chance of keeping pace with inflation.
Yeah, and that's right. And again, I'd mention on Sorted, on sorted.org.nz, we've got our retirement calculator that incorporates a lot of the assumptions, for example, of the returns you get if you invested it in a balanced fund over that time, what inflation might be, which typically we'd assume to be 2%, which is the midpoint of the government target. So then we could the assumptions invariably are going to be wrong, because we know that inflation fluctuates, that returns fluctuate. But making an assumption helps us do some forward planning, run some numbers, and understand if we're in the ballpark of what we can expect.
Well, let's talk a little bit more shortly about where to start and utilizing some of those tools so that we can feel a little less stressed about the idea of retirement and maybe even a little excited. We're going to be back right after the break with Tom Hartman. Welcome back to the Prosperity Project. We're with Tom Hartman from the Retirement Commission talking about retirement. What do you think stops people, Tom, more proactively preparing for retirement? Is it just that they've got more immediate concerns, that the numbers have made them feel overwhelmed and so they don't know where to start, or is it something else?
It is overwhelming, but there have also been studies that are pretty interesting that when you spend time thinking about your future self, the way our brain works, it actually sees that person, that future Nadine, for example, as a stranger, someone you don't really know. And so actually setting aside money for that person to retire on can feel like giving money away to someone else, someone who you haven't met, which is a strange thing. And so I don't know if you've ever come across these apps that can show you what you'll look like in 20 years or in 30 years and 40, to get an idea of, what you'll who you'll be and to get to know that person but that's one of the barriers is actually just that feeling that we don't know what the future will bring and if it'll ever come and who I'll be in the future and who is this, so I think that's one of the barriers as well. The present is so much more salient to us. There's so much more all those everyday needs and everything we're doing that we can't picture it so clearly.
That's so interesting. And I'm not going to be in any hurry to download one of those apps because I feel like the outcome might be kind of scary. I'm wondering, though, when I look at the expenditure guidelines, the housing costs in it seem kind of low and housing is expensive. So, how much does a comfortable retirement rely on having either your own mortgage-free home or some other way of living very cheaply?
Yeah, it matters a great deal. And in fact, recently we just did, a really comprehensive analysis of what retirement looks like for New Zealanders. And, a lot of those findings, they really show that having a mortgage-free home, what a financial buffer it is compared to those renting who are having a much more difficult time. So those who are renting or have experienced life shocks after the age of 50, there are people with disabilities or long-term health conditions. Those people really have it the toughest. So in these figures, I think it's a lot about the idea that you're living in a mortgage-free home and that you're not still paying off a mortgage or renting. But we know that going forward, that's not going to be the case.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. If you're younger and you're looking at the price of housing and you're going, I don't know if that's ever going to be a possibility for me, that must be hugely discouraging. Or is that supposed to just encourage the younger generation to save even harder for their retirement?
Well, there are lots of different ways in order to get that done. Like we come across, groups of friends who are buying, they're getting on the property ladder together. There's the great wealth transfer that's happening between the baby boomers and the next generations. And obviously
that relies on having parents who own homes, right? So
that's right. People's situations are different, but there are the withdrawals from KiwiSaver that are going towards first homes that continue to stay strong. So people are finding ways to get on the housing ladder. And what they may not realize, because their more immediate goal is to get that first home, is what that'll mean to their financial security over the long term and what it'll mean in retirement. And that we're seeing that over and over.
I guess for those who are younger and joining KiwiSaver, they might well take a lot of comfort in the fact that, if you're in KiwiSaver for 30 or 35 years or longer, that's a long time for your money to grow and compound.
One of our popular tools on Sorted is our KiwiSaver calculator. And if you'd like to come on and see some projections, some estimates of where you could end up, both of how much you could have for a deposit for a first home, but also for where you might be when you want to step away from paid work, you'd be surprised. We haven't had a full cohort come through their careers and have KiwiSaver. It's a young scheme. It's only been around since 2007. And so once we do, for my children, for example, and those who come afterwards, and they'll have KiwiSaver their whole working lives, their results can be very impressive, and get them prepared and in the right spot for it.
Having said that, if we're only contributing at 3%, maybe plus 3% from your employer, is that going to be enough? Particularly if, say, I think the stats tell us we don't buy our first home until we're in our mid-30s. And so even if you get in early, you're going to pull that money out, buy a home, and start all over.
Yeah, our research is showing that for middle income earners, that is probably not enough. But for some people, it will be. Again, it all comes down to the income and how many dollars are going in. So what The problem with using percentages so much is that we think, for example, if I'm talking to you and say, oh, how much do you contribute? And you tell me you contribute, for example, 6%, and I tell you I contribute 6%, and we all feel like we're doing about the same thing. But if our incomes are radically different, which they probably are, no two people's incomes are exactly the same typically, we're putting in very different dollar amounts. We're going to end up in a very different place. And so a lot of the discussions about percentages and how much to put away, sometimes they're misleading, and we really need to get back to the dollar figures. How many dollars are being set aside, being invested, and what can that grow to over time? And as you say, for the younger generations now, people starting out their careers, for example, they have that power of time. And for those like Sandra who wrote in and have less time, they could have 10 years to compound significant results. And we invite people to run some projections on Sorted on our tools. It doesn't take much at all. A few clicks, a few figures to put in, and you can see results, very quickly of where you can.
I would absolutely give some props to the Sorted website, and we will put the link to those in the show notes, because you don't have to be a spreadsheet wizard or anything like that. You can just plug in a few key details, how much you've got, how much you're contributing, how old you are, and it'll give you some really useful numbers. And I guess, Tom, is that the best place to start, to actually start looking at the numbers rather than just looking at the years or even the number of paychecks before 65 and freaking out about it?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's in essence why we're here. I mean, lots of people don't know that the Sorted website is put out by the Retirement Commission team, but in essence, the push towards financial capability and towards maximizing KiwiSaver is to take advantage early on. And, even our school programs are oriented towards this, really sorting out, lifting financial capability so that people can be in the best possible position by the time they reach retirement. It's a great place to start. And as you say, we've had, the actuaries, the number experts behind the scenes working, so you don't have to create your own spreadsheet.
They've done the serious number crunching spreadsheet stuff that most of us are not wizards in.
Yeah.
I guess, and this is going to sound really self-serving, but I would generally suggest people get some financial advice.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be something that most Kiwis think of doing. Why do you think that is? Do they just think it's, I only need advice if I've got tons of money? Or is the financial services industry not serving them well enough? What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, one thing that doesn't often get said is that there are two things going on. There's an asymmetry of information. So the advisors hold a lot of the expertise and people hold a little bit less. That makes that conversation difficult. But the other thing that has been is historically that there's a sale going on there as well. And so people can't tell whether they're being told something or sold something. They really can't tell if they're being funneled into products that benefit the advisor or really would benefit them. And so if they can't tell that, that's going to be one of the reasons why they may not want to spend money on this. We like advisors who, really are fee for service. You're paying them for their time. They're obviously working for you. And we know that, financial advisors who are licensed are really required to put your interests first. And we really see Sorted, our website, as a way to enrich the conversation with an advisor. We are continually saying, good advice is gold. If you really need to be with a financial advisor who's licensed and who can really be there and work for your interests. It's
just a bit of a rarity in the industry, I think, to actually pay for advice rather than the advisor being paid by commission. I'm on a salary and ours is a fee for service model. And I think some people go, huh? What? Because if you go to a mortgage broker or whatever, it's all just, paid for by the trail commission and that kind of thing. But that might be a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. As I said, it's a big topic. There's more to discuss. But if there's one takeaway from this conversation is that ignorance is not bliss. Start by heading to the Sorted website, crunching some numbers, and then decide your next steps from there. Thank you so much, Tom Hartman.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project. You can follow this podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and please do chuck us a rating or a review while you're there. For more personal finance and business content, head to nzherald.co.nz, and please do feel free to get in touch with your questions and your stories. nadine.higgins@nzme.co.nz. A reminder though that this podcast is informational only, and nothing we say here should be considered personalised financial advice. But also remember that while listening to this podcast is hopefully going to be additive to your financial knowledge, and that is fantastic, knowing stuff doesn't create change. Doing stuff does. So what action are you going to take today to make your life more prosperous? My producer for this episode is Ethan Sills. Sound engineer is Richard Martin. I'm Nadine Higgins. Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project.